piece called Freedom that's in the materials at about page 10. That the right to liberty is actually two rights. What I call the derived right, which is a right not to be coerced by the state for bad reasons. And let's call it a substantive right to liberty, which is a right that certain actions not be coerced by the state for any reason. So the distinction is between the focus of the right on reasons or on actions. The derived right protects one from badly reasoned, badly motivated legislation. The substantive right of liberty protects an act from state coercion for any reason whatsoever. Below this is some subdivisions, and I want to keep it simple. So two sorts of rights. I mostly want to talk to you today about the substantive right to liberty, whether it's truly a right, whether it's only a presumption, whether it's some combination of the two. But to do that, I will go back to the derived right of liberty for a while. But remember where I stopped on the substantive right for liberty. We went through some of the Supreme Court cases, starting with Lochner and then Williamson, the Oklahoma case on opticians, and we were talking about abortion. The article we were discussing was Randy Barnett, a well-known libertarian in America, who correctly says the way the current American constitutional doctrine treats the substantive right of liberty, it looks like this. If on the horizontal axis you're measuring kinds of actions, different sorts of things people do, and on the vertical axis the degree to which those people should be protected against state coercion in those actions, degree of, if you like, protection of their liberty. That's the chart. It looks like contemporary law is this red line. Namely, for immoral action, the liberty to do those isn't worth anything, so the state can prohibit them. For ordinary actions that are not immoral, there is a weak presumption in favor of liberty, protected only by rational basis review, as in the Williamson case about the optician. If there's any possible reason that could rationally be served or believed to be served by the coercion, then the coercion is justified. But there's a small class of actions that are fundamental liberties in the sense that they get very high degrees of protection. That's a three-step substantive right to liberty. Only the last is really a right. This is a presumption, and this is nothing at all. I had two questions about this picture. One is whether you can justify these sharp breaks, or is it rather, as Randy Barnett pictures it, all actions are somewhat protected by liberty, i.e. negative liberty, i.e. it's always presumptively wrong for the state to coerce its citizens. It's just as easily justified for most actions why you get to coerce them if they kill people and so forth. But as one gets further out on this horizontal axis, they are more and more worthy of protection. It's just not as a bright line. It's as a matter of degree. And at some point, the degree of protection to which they're entitled would make you call it a right to liberty. That gets rid of the bright lines and has a degree-vague protection for liberty. So one question I left you with is, which is the right picture? Can we justify this sharp break in protection by saying something about what kind of actions these are that make it plausible they're specially entitled to protection against state coercion? The other question I also left you with is this one. Whether you have this picture or this picture, you need to say something about what measures, by the kind of action citizens do, a greater and greater degree of protection against state coercion. Why are some actions more liberty-worthy than others? What makes them entitled to more and more protection the further you go out here? No matter whether you have a smooth curve or a ragged curve, that question is the same. What makes actions, some of them, worth more protection? Now, so far I've said two things. One out of the 13 I want to talk about. One was to remind you of the difference between the derived right to liberty and the substantive right or presumption. Two is to remind you where we were on the two questions about the substantive right vis-a-vis a presumption. Is it really a weak presumption coupled with a strong right, that's contemporary American constitutional law, or is it one continuous presumption of increasing strength so that eventually, but vaguely, you'll call it a right? That's the second thing. Now, to get at those two questions, I want to go back over what Professor Hurd did a bit the other day and talk a bit about the derived right, because part of the answer about the substantive right comes out of what you already discussed about the derived right of liberty. So the third thing I want to do is just remind you of the Millian taxonomy from 1859 through, for example, the 4 books of Joel Feinberg in the 1980s, through just about anybody that writes about liberty in the Western tradition. Mill said, as Hurd said, there are 4 sorts of principles, only one of which is legitimate to justify state coercion. A legislator may properly aim at preventing harm to others with coercive legislation. Although it's conceptually possible to aim at these 3 things, according to Mill, they're all improper. You should not aim to prohibit behavior that only harms the actor or those with whom the actor consents. That's paternalism, and that's bad, Mill said. You should not aim to prohibit behavior that harms no one, the actor, nor anybody else. It just offends them. They sit next door and they imagine what homosexuals are doing and they don't like it. Mill said that's illegitimate as well, as has the US Supreme Court. The third thing that is a bad reason is you might prohibit it simply because it's immoral. Mill thought that was also illicit for a legislator to aim at. You shouldn't prohibit people from doing things that hurt nobody else and not even themselves, just because you think their behavior is immoral, like certain sexual practices. So for Mill, you end up with one legitimate aim of legislation and 3 illegitimate aims. If you're counting, that's the third thing I want to say. Sorry for the numbers, but we're going to do a lot of things. It's easier if we know them. The fourth thing I want to say then begins our discussion. About this derived right, what did you learn from Professor Hurd, the younger one, yesterday? About why Mill would have had this theory. What is it that made Mill say, well now, regulating, prohibiting behavior that harms other people, that's legitimate for a liberal state. Regulating behavior that only harms the actors involved, or only offends people, or doesn't do any of those but is anyway thought to be immoral, that's not legitimate. What is it, fourth question, fourth thing I want to talk about, that motivates someone like Mill to say this? It's an old puzzle about John Stuart Mill, who was a well-known 19th century utilitarian. Son of James Mill, who was a colleague of Jeremy Bentham's in England in the late 18th century. They together both led the fight against slaving, slave trading, slave owning in the British colonies, ultimately successfully. So Mill comes from a family of utilitarianism, and he is one of the world's famous utilitarians. How does he get from his utilitarianism to this set of principles about how a legislator ought to aim in her legislation? think it's too hard to see. If you think that criminal law, like all law, is subject to one ultimate moral principle, all legislation should aim to increase the happiness, decrease the unhappiness of your citizens, each to count for one, as Bentham said. That's utilitarianism. Then you might say, if you're Mill, it seems to me with that theory of why we punish people at all, we can get these principles. So let me be John Stuart Mill for 5 minutes. Remember where Bentham starts on punishment in 1789. He wrote 10 volumes he projected on a rational penal code for a liberal state. He only wrote 1, projected 10. But in number 1, Principles of Morals and Legislation, he said punishment, unlike that guy across the pond named Kant. Kant said punishment of the guilty is an intrinsic good. Bentham said that's nonsense. Punishment hurts those you punish, that's its nature. It's intrinsically bad. It can only be justified if it prevents something better than the badness that it causes. It's always a balance. What's the better thing punishment achieves? Bentham to Mill. It achieves the prevention of harm to others. If you can prevent harm to others with your criminal laws, then although they, by their nature, do a nasty thing to people that nobody wants and it hurts them, namely punishment, they're justified if they cause a greater good. And the greater good is the prevention of harm to others. So that harm to others becomes your principle seems to fall out directly from your general theory of why you have criminal law or law at all. You have law to make everyone better off. Punishment makes them worse off, but it can make them net better off if it prevents harm to others. And then you can see his rejection of these 3 reasons in one of 2 ways, and I think you should see it in both ways for some liberal like Mill. Namely, if behavior doesn't harm anybody else, but it only harms the actor involved, then you could say, well, but then punishing that actor harms him. Are you preventing a greater harm to him when you prohibit behavior that harms only him? Well, he doesn't think so, because he wants to do it. In which event, you don't have harm to others justifying doing the harm that is punishment. You only have harm to the actor who doesn't regard it as a harm, which would justify doing what he would think is a harm, which is punishing him. You might think a utilitarian would say, no to this one. You can't justify doing the harm of punishment to him by preventing behavior that he doesn't think is a harm and doesn't harm anybody else. Similarly, if the behavior isn't harmful at all, not to the actor and not to anybody else, if it only offends people, you might think Mill's view is, well, offense is at most a soft harm, as it's usually called, a psychic harm. It couldn't possibly justify the state imposing the hard harm that is punishment, locking people up, killing them, taking away their property. It couldn't justify on a utilitarian balance the hard harm that is punishment by the soft harm that is the prevention of offense. Thirdly, that something is immoral, that doesn't harm anybody else, doesn't harm the actor, and doesn't even offend anybody. There's no gain in utility in prohibiting things that harm nobody else, don't harm the actor, don't even offend anybody. Only gain in utility would be if somehow doing the moral thing had some utility. Bentham's famous line. He said, legal rights are nonsense. But he said, they're only simple nonsense. Natural rights, the morality of natural rights, he says, that's nonsense on stilts. So, as a good utilitarian, there's just zero gain per utilitarian, out of punishing, prohibiting actions that don't hurt anybody else, don't hurt the actor, and aren't even offensive. They're just wrong. There's no gain, but there's clearly a loss because you're doing the harm that is punishment. So you might think this falls straight out a utilitarian theory of punishment. Criminal law exists to prevent crime. Crime should be defined as only those things that you really want to prevent, namely the ones that are behaviors harmful to others. Not behaviors only harmful to the own actor, or only offensive, or not harmful in any sense, but simply immoral. A straight utilitarian motivation. Now, when we were discussing Justice Peckham's opinion in Lockwood, the case in New York, bread bakers, I think you can see a second motivation for these limiting principles. So now divide this million list up into, these are the good guys, yes, this you can aim at, and no, you can't aim at these. The first view of the no's is you can't aim at these because you don't get a gain in utility. But a second view, harder for Mill to justify as utilitarian but seemingly present, is to say it is independently offensive to liberty to have legislation tell people what's good for them. It is independently offensive to liberty to tell people that what they want to do can be prohibited for no better reason than that others don't like it. It is independently offensive to liberty to think that you can tell people what they can't do, even though it doesn't harm them, anybody else, or even offend anyone, just because the majority of your citizens think it's immoral. You can see Mill as having an independent motivation for these three no's, in addition to thinking there's simply an absence of utilitarianism. Now, I don't know how much that is by way of reminder, but nonetheless, I think that would be a standard view of what motivates the Millian taxonomy and the line he draws. The liberal state, in its criminal law, may only aim to prevent harm to others by coercing behavior harmful to others. It may not aim at the good of the individual coerced, even if it's harmful to him, nor may it aim to prevent offense, nor may it aim simply to prevent what's wrong. What happens if you leave the social philosophy of utilitarianism? And as one of you asked me some days ago, what if you read more Kant and Hegel that might be good for you? What if you're Kantian or Hegelian about punishment? You don't think criminal law exists to prevent harms. You think it exists to punish culpable wrongdoers who deserve to be punished. You think like Kant, namely, I see there is a Kant University in Kaliningrad. Well, I think he would have called it Königsberg. He did teach under the Russians, if you know that, for several years when the Russians took Königsberg. So perhaps you would recognize it. Kant, the reason you punish people is because they deserve it. Justice is served. Even if the last man on an island is a murderer and the society is going to disband, justice is served, retributive justice, by punishing people who deserve it. It's not to prevent crime. It's to make bad people pay for their crimes that you have a punishment system called the criminal law. Suppose you thought that, as indeed some of us in the 21st century do. In the English-speaking world, if you want a defense of that, chapters 2 to 4 of Placing Blame by Michael Moore, for example, defend that in detail as the right theory of criminal law. Suppose that's your theory of the criminal law. Would that generate the harm principle? This is the fifth thing I want to discuss with you. Change the theory of punishment. Does it change the theory of proper legislative aim? And the answer is surely yes. If you think with Kant, the aim of the criminal law is to punish guilty people, then you should legislate substance to the criminal law prohibitions in accordance with what you think makes people guilty. What makes them guilty? Doing morally wrong things with that wrongness in their mind that we call culpability makes them deserving of punishment. and you end up not with a harm principle, you end up with a wrong principle. Namely, a notion that you should aim in your criminal legislation to prohibit all and only moral wrongs. That would be a quite different theory of legislative aim. Now, once you see this possibility, that a Kantian liberal state looks a lot different than a Bentham/Millian liberal state in its principles, you should also see there's a third possibility. In the English-speaking world, and I think it's true in the German system as well, the dominant theory of punishment is neither Millian utilitarianism, nor is it Kantian retributivism. It's what's usually called a mixed theory. A mixed theory says we have criminal law for two quite different reasons. One is the utilitarian reason to prevent crime. The other is the Kantian reason to get retributive justice, to punish those who deserve it by their culpable wrongdoing. But you need both. It's a conjunctive theory. You need both prevention of crime and you need some retributive justice in order to justify the criminal sanction, in general or in any particular case. Usually called the mixed theory of punishment. If you held that theory of punishment, what theory of legislation would you have? Well, then you'd have a theory that said any act that is harmful and is morally wrong can be prohibited. Any act that is either not harmful to others or not wrongful may not be prohibited. Douglas Husack's recent book, Oxford Press 2008, called Overcriminalization, adopts this kind of mixed view of punishment. There's two good reasons to have criminal law and to punish people: prevention of crime and retributive justice. No surprise in his principles of legislation, the things at which legislatures may permissibly aim in coercing their citizens, he has both a harm to others principle and a moral wrong principle. No surprise, because those then are the two criteria of valid criminal legislation that you would have to have. So, if we're still talking about Professor Hurd's topic, legitimate aims of legislation, notice the utilitarian says the only aim is to prohibit harms to others. That's what justifies the harm or punishment. The Kantian retributivist, or the retributivist in general, says your proper aim is to punish what's morally wrong. To get those who deserve punishment by doing something morally wrong, the punishment that they deserve. The mixed theorist combines the two. On a mixed theory of punishment, your right theory of legislation in a liberal state is to prohibit only things that are morally wrong and that are harmful.
What is it supposed to be in? Could it be or?
Logically, there's space for the or theory. Each of these theories of punishment has some well-known problems. The problem with the or version is it inherits the problems of each. There's an old punk rocker called Blondie, years and years ago. Her most famous song was "I'm Gonna Get Ya One Way or the Other." I call yours the Blondie theory. I'm going to get you either if it serves to prevent crime, or if you did something morally wrong. Let me just say what demotivates that theory. Instead of Blondie, how about the Sergei theory? All right?
I think the last one is the best one.
Wrong or harmful. When you're teaching standard punishment theory, the problems with utilitarianism are that they seem to justify punishment of the innocent. Because if all you have criminal law to do is effect a net gain in social welfare, then although it really hurts an innocent person to punish them, you can get a great gain in social welfare. Even if it's an innocent person, as long as your society doesn't know it's innocent, by punishing that innocent person and getting a gain in social welfare by others being deterred, by thinking the guilty person's been caught and punished. That's a problem. It seems to punish the innocent. The problem with retributivism is it seems to punish the guilty even though you're not getting any social good like preventing crime. Most people are attracted, both the descendants of Kant in Germany and the descendants of Mill in England. Most theorists are attracted by the mixed theory because it eliminates both of those problems. You don't punish behavior if it's not wrongful because being wrong is a necessary condition of punishment. You don't punish behavior simply if it's wrong, if it doesn't affect some gain in crime, because being harmful to others is a necessary condition. So the and is deliberately chosen. This theory of punishment, unlike this one, doesn't suffer the serious problems of each of these two theories. I mean, despite that, I'm up here, but nonetheless, most people are down here, and there's nobody over here that I know of. Yeah.
Well, actually, I'm basing on my position on your article. Whether you're criticizing Mill's position, you were speaking about the case of punishing or prohibiting people for being cruel to animals.
Good.
So, no harm,
Yep.
but a wrong thing.
Right.
So, here we use wrong thing.
Good.
And in other cases, there are cases where no moral harm, let's say, and there is a harm to people. So we could punish it too. So we actually mix them. But it's not and, it's or.
Only if you come out one way rather than another on those thought experiments. What Sergei has reminded you of is indeed what both Professor Hurd and I have talked about at various points in the readings and here. If you have a mixed theory that has two conditions, individually necessary and jointly sufficient for a justified coercive punishment, then there's two kinds of counterexamples. When you have wrongs without harms, can those be punished? And we have harms to others without wrongs, can those be punished, right? So, let's do that. I think she must have done some of this with you yesterday, yes? Awesome. So let's take the two kinds of counterexamples. Let's do the behavior that's harmful, but not wrongful. Behavior that's harmful, but not wrongful. So you get no retributive justice in its punishment because there's no moral wrong to punish for. But you do get, on a utilitarian ground, prevention of harm to others, as long as criminal law has some deterrent effect, or at least an incapacity effect, about the particular individual. What was her example yesterday? I presume she gave you something like competitive injury, right? I'm running a perfectly good business. You can run it better than me, so you put your business next to my business. I am seriously harmed. I am put out of business and bankrupt when my children starve. Remember, the capitalist companies don't have any safety nets. They starve. It's really harmful. But it's wrongful. It doesn't look wrongful. You think everybody is entitled to compete, and losers lose in a capitalist economy. That's how it works. And then the question is, well, maybe we're wrong about that. Maybe we should punish harmful behavior that's not wrongful. Examples from Hurd's book are boxing. There's lots of harm in boxing. Given its consensual nature, nobody thinks of it as wrongful to throw a punch. It only becomes wrongful if you throw a low punch against the rules. Ordinary punches are harmful, but they're not wrongful. And therefore, many people think, shouldn't be criminal. So it looks like this shouldn't be punished. Do you think this should be punished, those cases?
Not those cases. What about tax evasion? Is it tax evasion?
Tax evasion.
Yeah. I don't think it's it could be. We could think of it not as a wrongful thing, but it's sure a harmful thing. We have an indirect harm.
Yeah.
And it is,
but is that what most of you think? Do you think tax evasion is not harmful?
it could be thought of as not the wrong thing, because the state is a system, is a machine that takes money from you. So it's not a bad thing to take some money.
But if I don't pay my taxes, what happens to your taxes?
I don't know.
They go up. They have to go up or you end up like America. Come Tuesday, we're bankrupt. So your taxes have to go up if I don't pay mine. In which event, it's wrongful not to pay your taxes. It's wrongful not to contribute, I think. In which event, you ought to punish tax evasion.
What does it mean to be wrongful? How do you verify
it's wrongful in the way that free riders in economics are always wrongful. When we have a collective enterprise, the old example is a streetcar where nobody's collecting the fare. It's an honor system. We all pay a certain amount, and that allows the streetcar to operate to all of our benefit. But if I become a free rider, and I see that if I don't pay, you're still going to pay, then I get to ride for free and you have to pay. And eventually, you're going to have to pay more or the system goes bankrupt. In which event, I am not contributing to something from which I am benefiting. For me, that's wrong. I think you ought to contribute. Now, if you don't think that, then that's not a good example, but I think that, in which event, it's harmful and it's wrongful, in which event you can punish it.
For me, just hard to find maybe to find a better example. But I still think we could think of example because it's really I'm thinking of the wrongful term because it could be wrongful for some people and not wrongful for others. So we could think of the criminal prohibition that not everybody shares. So some people would think it is not a wrongful thing to do, but is criminalized.
Let's leave aside disagreement. You don't actually need disagreement to make your point. Did Professor Hurd use cruelty to animals yesterday as an example? Burning cats for fun. Most criminal codes prohibit burning cats just because you like to hear them scream. It's nasty, right? Now, that doesn't harm anybody but the cat, as long as nobody has to listen to it, and it's not owned. Stray cats. Killing stray cats for fun doesn't harm any actor in our system. Cats aren't citizens. You may remember when the Roman Emperor Caligula made his horse a citizen of the Roman Empire, but that was to show his power to do something that nobody thought could possibly be the case. Cats are not citizens, so harming cats is not harming others under the harm principle. Sure looks wrongful to me to burn a cat for fun. In which event, it's wrongful, but not harmful. And once you see that example, in his book, Harmless Wrongdoing, Joel Feinberg gives you these kinds of examples. Imagine a rather excessively celebratory Irish wake. Somebody dies, the Irish get together and they drink and eat and have a good time to celebrate life. Suppose the way they celebrate it is they have the body of the deceased and they serve it up, as he puts it, with garlic and cloves, and they cook it nicely, and everybody has some good Irish beer and a piece of the deceased. They have a feast to celebrate the passing of the deceased by eating his body, a cannibalistic wake. You might think that doesn't harm anybody, the guy's dead. But you might also think it's wrongful, or you might not. What about this one, Feinberg says? Suppose people get tired of special effects. They want to see the real thing the way the Romans used to see it. So they rent Yankee Stadium in New York City. They don't allow anybody in who's not consenting, and they charge high ticket prices, and they pay all participants extraordinary sums of money to participate. If you lose, you're dead, so they pay it to your estate. And then they have real Roman gladiatorial contests. It doesn't harm anybody other than those who are fully consenting adults, both who paid money or are going to be paid money to take the risks. But you might think it's wrongful for human beings to engage in the enterprise even though it's not harmful. Now those examples look better, right? That looks like you could prohibit wrongful behavior even if it's not harmful. But of course, who believes that? Well, people like me. People who are retributivists about the criminal law think this is exactly right. Of course you can punish wrongful behavior that's not harmful. We just don't think you can punish harmful behavior that's not wrongful. You can punish wrongful but not harmful, but you can't punish this. A mixed theorist about punishment shouldn't think you could punish this either, but a utilitarian would. We wouldn't think you could punish this either. General point. Where you think the theory of punishment is correct determines what's the proper theory of legislative aim. So, I think I've made 7 points on my calculation. We started with Mill. What makes Mill intelligible is his general theory of punishment, which is utilitarian. What would make the only aim at wrongdoing plausible would be a Kantian theory of punishment. What would make aim at either wrongdoing or harm-doing together plausible would be a mixed theory of punishment. These 3 theories of punishment leads to 3 theories of proper legislative aim. That means at the end of the day, when you're taxonomizing legislative aim, suppose you're a mixed theorist. You think it takes both wrongfulness and harmfulness to justify punishment, coercion. Then your list is going to look a bit different than Mill's. Proper legislative aim is going to be, you may only aim to prohibit wrongdoing when it's coupled with harm to others, and you may not aim at anything else. Specifically, you may not aim at behavior that is just harmful to others. A fortiori, you may not aim at behavior that is only harmful to the actor themselves. You may not aim at behavior that is only offensive, because that's neither wrongful nor harmful. And you may not aim at behavior that's only wrongful but not harmful. You're going to end up with a rather different taxonomy of proper legislative aims, depending on your theory of punishment. Now, I said my ultimate interest today was not the derived right of liberty. That's what I've just been talking about. But is rather the substantive right, but that this can help us. So my 8th point is this one. Once we do a reconceptualizing of different possible schemas of permissible legislative aims, we now have the first of 3 possible reasons as to how to define the liberty worthiness of actions, that is, their immunity to state coercion. The first is because you think certain kinds of actions, given their attributes, it would be impossible for there to be any good reason to criminalize them. Notice what you're doing. You're taking your theory of proper legislative aim, and you're saying a legislature could not rationally aim at wrongdoing if the behavior they're criminalizing is not wrong. A legislature could not rationally aim at prohibiting harm to others, preventing harm to others, if the behavior they're regulating isn't harmful to others. You're deriving substantive limits on the kinds of actions that can be prohibited for any reason from the limits on the kinds of reasons that may properly motivate legislation. Does everybody see the general move? It's from reasons to actions. There are only some reasons that are proper. You couldn't rationally have those reasons unless the actions had certain characteristics. You couldn't rationally be aiming to prohibit wrongdoing, to stamp it out, if the behavior you're punishing isn't wrong. You couldn't rationally be aiming to prevent harm to others if the behavior you're prohibiting isn't harmful to others. In which event you end up, depending on your punishment theory, with 3 sorts of possible limits of this kind. if you're utilitarian about punishment, so the only proper aim of criminal legislation is to prevent harm to others greater than the harm that is punishment, then if an act is not harmful to others, it can't be prohibited. If you're a Kantian, criminal law exists to punish all and only those who morally deserve it. Then if the act isn't morally wrong, there's no retributive justice gained out of punishing it, so don't prohibit it. You can't prohibit acts that are not morally wrong, because the thing you're trying to do with the criminal law, punish wrongdoers, won't be done, which event you can't punish acts that are not wrong. If you're a mixed punishment theorist, then acts that are not harmful can't be punished, and acts that are not wrong can't be punished, i.e., acts that are not harmful and wrong may not be punished. It's in Germany once doing the Army project, and I did that. Some German graduate student raised his hand. He says, in Germany, he did a complex inference, and I said, you know, that's true in America, so let's just correct the mistake. So acts that are not harmful and wrongful on a mixed theory of punishment. The state cannot have good reason to punish either. Now that's the first of three possible reasons why it is you would end up with this difference in the degree to which criminal law can use its coercion for certain kinds of actions. It's one of the three sorts of things that can make sense of why this slope is going up or why there's this big break, because some actions are not wrongful, not harmful, not wrongful, and harmful. They're out of the scope of a proper criminal law. They can't rationally be regulated by a legislature trying to do what it should do, prohibit things that serve the ends of punishment. I know you spent some time on the harm principle, but let's spend a little bit more. Now, not as a theory of legislative aim, but as a theory about the kinds of actions that can't be prohibited. So pretend we're a utilitarian. We have Mill's harm principle. The most famous criticism of Mill's book on liberty was J.F. Steffen's book in 1872, Law, Liberty, and Morality. No, that wasn't quite right. Liberty, Morality, Fraternity, I think it is, 1872. Here's the famous Stephen argument. Foremost theoretician of the English criminal law in the 19th century. He happened to be the novelist Virginia Woolf's uncle as well. Criticism. He says there really are no acts that are not harmful to others in some way or another. All acts hurt somebody in some way or another, so this is an empty set. If this is what Mill is proposing as the bulwark of liberty that defines when it can be the case that you just cannot regulate it, this is an empty set. There are no acts over here that are not harmful to others. What do you think? Who's right about that? Mill or his critic, John Fitzjames Stevens? Sergey, what do you think? Vladimir, what do you think?
No, I think don't get the question. I don't know.
That harms no one else is over here, can't be regulated. Behavior that harms others can be regulated if there's good enough reason, right? That's the supposed line Mill has proposed for us. That's what the harm principle is supposed to do. It's supposed to give you this line between what cannot be prohibited at all and what can be. The sphere of liberty for Mill is here, and this line is where behavior harms others. Stevens' criticism, there's no such line. All behavior harms others in some way or another. Suicide's a good example. So is riding without a motorcycle helmet. Are there harms to others? With a little imagination, you can always think of possible harms. Go back to motorcycle riders. You ever seen a motorcycle accident where the guy didn't have a helmet on? I was in Oregon many years ago. I used to ride a motorcycle, sometimes without a helmet. There was an accident where the guy smashed his head. And I remember a mother taking her young children, or two of them, over to the scene and said, look at that. That's what happens when you ride without a helmet. I'm sure they got the message. That image has to be in their brain today. There were brains all over the pavement. So that was a harm. There's that kind of harm. There's the non-support harm. There's the childless, the parentless child possible harm. If you think about it, there's probably always some kind of harm. Now, if you're John Stuart Mill, this is obvious. So how do you defend your line? The line between what liberty absolutely protects and what protects only weakly. Anybody?
This is supposed to be serious harm and available harm. But when you speak about serious or available, we need the criteria, and probably the wrong thing could be one of those, but not the only. So we actually do not have this strict line, we have the number.
Good. Remember, we're doing two things. One is to justify any kind of division at all, and the other is to try and decide, is it a sharp line or a fuzzy line? Sergei's point is, if there's a line, it's got to be fuzzy. Because harms come in degrees of seriousness, and this line doesn't take that into account. Notice there's another aspect of fuzziness. It's the one Mill actually refers to, even in the selection that you have from his book on liberty and our materialism. He says harms can be more or less direct. It's what every lawyer in the Anglo-American system learns as proximate causation. Some harms are direct and close, some harms are pretty remote, and some harms are so remote that lawyers don't think of them as causes at all. That also is a vague by degree difference in terms of degrees of directness of causation. Degrees of seriousness of harm, degrees of directness of causation. If you're using a harm principle to divide actions protected by liberty and those only weakly so, surely you want this rather than this, given the vagueness of the criteria of what distinguishes protected actions from not protected actions. It looks like at least Mill would have to give Stephen the degree vagueness. But does he have to give anything more than that? Is there a difference between the harm to others inflicted, say, by suicide, and the harm to others inflicted, say, by homicide? Pretty direct, right? If I go up and shoot someone because I want them dead, I have caused harm to others in a very direct way. If I shoot myself, I may have caused harm to others if others care about me or depend upon me in various ways. But it's less direct, it's less of a cause of a less serious harm. In which event, Mill might be able to defend the green line even if he can't defend the red one with the harm to others criteria. Now remember what we just did. We were looking at one possible criteria of what divides actions strongly protected by liberty from those that are not, namely the Millian criterion. But only want to use the Millian criterion if you're a mixed theorist about punishment or a utilitarian about punishment. For a Kantian, this is all just irrelevant. It doesn't have anything to do with the right line about what should be protected and what shouldn't. But for Millians and their descendants and mixed theorists, they want to say liberty protects acts that don't harm anybody else very much, in which event you end up with this kind of a law. That's the utilitarian and, to that extent, the mixed theorist line. What about the Kantian line? Can Kant defend this line any better than Mill? Actions that are not morally wrong may not be prohibited in a criminal system aimed at retributive justice. Kant. Is that line brighter than actions that are not harmful to others? Are some actions right and others wrong with no in-between? Or do we have degrees of wrongness like we have degrees of harmfulness? Elena, what do you think?
I just listened about it. Not to say really.
You know the old saying, pushing it is as good as poetry? Are all wrongs equally wrong? I come over and sort of spill this on you. Is that as wrong as shooting you?
I'm sorry
line for Mill and thought he couldn't justify this. He could only justify a vague by degree line between actions protected by liberty and those not. Now ask the Kantian the same question. Can you justify a line saying any action that's not wrong is protected by liberty? Those that are wrong may be prohibited by the criminal law if certain good reasons are produced, in addition to just that it's wrong. Is that a bright line, or is that only at best a vague by degree line? Because how wrong something is varies just as much as how harmful it is, and indeed it might even vary along one of the same criteria. Many moral wrongs are wrongful in that they cause harm, in which event it might be just as vague, and not just as vague, just as vague for exactly the same reason. Causation is vague, and so is degree of harm, and if wrongdoing depends on those, then Kant no more than Mill can defend a bright line. It must be a vague line between what liberty protects and what it doesn't protect, except by a weak presumption. I see hands in answer.
Well, you told two positions. First, is there a strict line? And can Kant sustain or argue for that line? I don't think we could say this is a strict line because there are degrees. That's my position. Well, there are different bad things or different good things, and they differ in their degrees.
Mm-hmm.
So, first, second, to evaluate that degree, do we need to come to harm principle? I don't think it is possible, but I don't think we always have to use the harm principle because.
Well, if you're a retributivist, you don't want to use the harm principle at all.
At all. So we could use just like some theory of values or system of values, not only or even not at all a harmful, but a principle of harm.
Well, that's right. But if we did use it, as you say, it could be by degrees of wrongfulness. What about these things Hurd had on board the other day? Where are these guys? That'll do. How about these guys? Where you don't give your kidney. As I understood my report on what you believe collectively, is that even though your brother or your cousin needs your kidney, it would be subrogatory not to give it, supererogatory to give it, but you're not obligated to give it. If that's what you think, do you have the capacity to criminalize subrogatory acts if you think criminal law should be punishing deserving people? Or is that something we can have a bright line for? Subrogatory acts are lacking in virtue, but we can't punish that. Obligatory acts are wrong not to do, or to do if they're prohibited. That we can punish. Did most of you come out saying you didn't have to give your kidney? Is that where you ended up?
This is a good example showing that we don't have a bright line.
Well, here's what it shows. It shows it's not obligatory to do certain actions which it nonetheless would be morally good to do.
Sure. So
It would be morally good to do it, but it's not obligatory. In which event, it's not wrong to do it, it just lacks virtue, or if you like, it's suberogatory. And then the question is, does that blur this line, or are suberogatory acts over here? They're lacking in virtue, but you can nonetheless punish them because they're bad, or are they over here? They're lacking in virtue, but there's no wrongfulness, there's no failure of obligation. So a retributive state cannot punish them. Liberty protects such suberogatory, i.e. non-virtuous actions that it was not obligatory to perform. I think Kant would say the second. This line can be pretty bright. Suberogatory acts may not be punished because they're not wrongful. They are lacking in virtue. So maybe this line looks better than you might think.
Could you explain the last thing again?
Well, you might think the only thing retributive justice justifies is making those who deserve punishment get it. People deserve punishment only if they do morally wrong things. They don't deserve punishment if they do things lacking in virtue. not donating a kidney lacks virtue, but it's not wrong, in which event you couldn't punish it on retributive grounds. That's where that would
What's
go.
a lack virtue? What is that?
What's that?
Lacking virtue?
Lacks virtue. Well, I don't know. Herd had this big word. I was trying to make it simple. She had subarrogatory.
All right.
It lacks virtue. It would be good for you to give your kidney, but you're not required by morality to give your kidney. In which event it's not wrongful. It's lacking in virtue. i.e. it's not as good as it could be, but it's not wrongful. That's what I was trying to get at. If that line looks reasonably clear, then for retributivists, this line can look reasonably clear, although you've got the degree of wrongness that you still have to worry about. Now, what have we been doing? Remind what the forest looks like. We're trying to figure out whether you can say about certain kinds of actions, they have attributes marking them out for greater protection of liberty. As a first cut to possibilities. For a utilitarian, actions that harm no one else very much. For a retributivist, actions that are not morally wrong are protected. Actions that harm others or that are morally wrong for either of these people, prima facie can be prohibited. That's a first cut at how you characterize the actions deserving of more protection under the right of liberty. Remember I said there were three such kinds of reasons. That's only the first. The first kind of reason, saying what actions have to have in the way of attributes to make them worthy of being protected by liberty, is one of these things coming out of your theory of punishment and your theory about the derived right to liberty in terms of harms and wrongs. Now that's not what most of the Supreme Court cases we were looking at were doing. They thought in addition to this, there was also some other sorts of attributes of actions or choices that made them worthy of protection as part of this strong right of liberty. That is that you might sometimes have a moral and thus legal right to liberty to do the moral wrong thing. I know you discussed that yesterday a bit with her. If that's true, if you ever have the right to do the morally wrong thing, then this isn't enough. We need other criteria for what defines Mill's sphere of action immune to state coercion. This is only a good start. Depending on your theory of punishment, actions that are not wrongful or actions that are not harmful to other people cannot be prohibited. But even some actions that are harmful to others, like abortion, or actions that are morally wrong, like some parenting decisions, which are terrible, or atrocious with regard to kids, and harmful, nonetheless might be protected by this substantive right to liberty. The trick is to articulate what other sorts of attributes actions would have to be part of this strong right or sphere of liberty that's protected. That's what number B is. Number B is a stab at the degree of liberty taken by prohibiting an action. Namely, maybe it's the case that if you prohibit some kinds of actions, you intrude on liberty in some way greater than other kinds of actions. Remember, we started this discussion on Monday with Isaiah Berlin and degrees of liberty, the last long footnote in his essay. He said, liberty comes in degrees. Maybe some prohibitions of some kinds of actions take more liberty than prohibitions of other kinds of actions. It looks like that could easily be the case. Here's some attempts through possibilities. One is, it's not an act at all, it's an omission. When the criminal law requires you to do something, as opposed to forbids you to do something, remember the slogan I started with on Monday. One positive requirement takes more liberty than many negative prohibitions. So maybe people who are called libertarians often say this, you can define the sphere of liberty as a sphere of immunity from positive requirements in the criminal law. Criminal law can't require you to prevent someone's death. It can prohibit you from causing their death. It can give you negative duties not to kill. It can't give you positive duties to save. I think that's plausible. In the old days when I took a course called Soviet Law, Harold Berman at Harvard, I remember the Soviet criminologists criticizing the cowboys of the West, i.e. America, because we don't impose very many positive duties. And at least in the old comrades courts for the Soviet Union, you had positive duties of rescue, criminalized not to rescue. Who had it right? Capitalist cowboys of Western America, or the comrade courts of the old Soviet Union? Do you have positive duties to help somebody else?
Yeah.
Yes.
Not absolute.
Not absolute. Morally, do you think you should?
No.
Not only
Close
morally,
the heart.
Who's talking, Furry?
There's two options. If I close the heart, then I have to say something. The second option is...
That's right, suppose I didn't do that.
Yes, the second option is if I have a legal duty or contractual duty to care about something.
Suppose you don't have that.
If I don't, nothing from this, I don't have any obligation.
Now that's the law, right?
Yes.
Morally speaking, suppose we're Kantians. We're going to punish wrongdoing, and the question is this wrong? Is it wrong not to, suppose I fall over here, I'm not still sick, and you see me gasping my last breath and you all sit there and take notes. Is there any moral complaint?
Of course.
Well, okay, so it's not me, so it's you. Is there no moral complaint? Now, hard-hearted libertarians, as they're called in America, think the answer is no, there's no moral complaint. You're not morally obligated to save anybody else. The old saying in the American West was, everybody carries your own water. If you run out of your own water, that's your problem. It would be good to help you, but it's not obligatory. That would be one view, but if you don't share that view, as I do not, it can't be a bright line saying the state can never positively require you to do something. It can be another fuzzy line, however. So ask yourself this question. Suppose you think there's an obligation to help others, either because you caused their peril, you've got some contractual relation, or if you're like me, it doesn't matter, even if you're a stranger, you still have an obligation to help them. And then you don't do it and they die. How does your blameworthiness compare with the blameworthiness of a person who doesn't like another person, and he puts a gun in her head and blows her life away? He's caused death. The first person has only failed to prevent death. Are they equally blamable? It doesn't seem like it, does it? Isn't there a real difference between the extreme blameworthiness of those who cause harms like death, kill, and those who, although they should, fail to prevent it? In which event you may think there's something to this. You can make a fuzzy but not a bright line. Namely, you can say criminal statutes that require actions take more liberty with less reason than criminal statutes that prohibit actions. Even if the actions are morally wrong not to do, to require them takes more liberty and they're less wrong when you don't do them than if a state prohibits actions and somebody does a prohibited action. It's more wrong and less liberty is taken. So a possible fuzzy line, these pages are the pages in your reading where this stuff is discussed. A fuzzy line could be, in addition to the wrongness and harmfulness criterion, ask whether it's an act or an omission that the statute is criminalizing. Omissions are entitled to greater protection by liberty because statutes requiring you not to omit take more liberty in comparison to negative prohibitions. So whether it's an act or an omission, that would matter too in trying to draw this line about the sphere of protected liberty. Try this one. I call this the Aristotelian criterion on page 15 of the material. Aristotle said the choices you make in your life define who you are. The U.S. Supreme Court, in its Aristotelian moments, thinks there are some of those choices that have more to do with self-definition than others. If you look at Justice Blackmun's opinion in dissent in Bowers, or Stevens, or the majority opinion in Lawrence, they all suggest there are, let's call them, self-defining choices. Choices that define the kind of person you are, or at least have a major impact on the kind of life you're going to lead. Those choices, you could say, those are the ones that are strongly protected as fundamental liberties. They're over here. Ordinary choices about where to have lunch, who to ask out for lunch, what classes to take, etc. Those are only protected by the weak presumption of liberty. But the self-defining ones, those choices are the ones protected by the fundamental right to liberty. That's what defines Mill's sphere. Are there self-defining choices? Let's think about the Supreme Court of the United States taxonomy. Choices about how you educate your kids. Parental choices. That's number one. Choices about becoming a parent. Griswold, birth control, abortion. Choices about sexual preference. Choices about whether you marry, how many times, who, and with what sex they have. Choices about what you do with your body, including allowing medical treatment. And sixthly, choices about where, when, and how you die. Those 6 things have received some degree of protection as fundamental liberties in the United States. Is that a fair taxonomy of self-defining choices? Choices that have to do with who you are as a person, and thus are entitled to more liberty, because if a state prohibits and regulates those choices, it takes away your very worth as a human being. It takes away more liberty to prohibit those choices than to prohibit ordinary ones. Is that a good line, Sergey?
I like the line, but the first example, I am not sure this is the strong example. To choose, so you're actually not self-defining choice, making not a self-defining choice, but a choice defining the destiny of your kids. So I'm not sure this is a quite good example.
I don't know, do you define yourself through your kids?
Do you have a right to do that?
No,
is
do
it
most people,
self-defining?
this is a psychological question. Do most people, if they have children, define who they are in part on who their kids are? What kind of people they are? There's an old
sure, but
parlor game that was played for many years, almost a century ago. Who are you? You have 3 answers and you don't get to think. Many people include in those 3 answers something about being the parent of their children. And at some stage, they care more about their children's success than about their own. If that's right, then self-defining could include what kind of people your kids become. Defines who you are.
So
It speaks for you.
So actually we have a situation where the kids do not have a self-defining choice then. Is that correct?
Well, not as kids. They eventually will be adults, and then they get to define who they are.
Yes. Well,
I mean, the trick of education, of course, is to guide them without coercing them into being just the person you want.
I understand your argumentation. I'm just thinking that this is a controversial issue still.
Sure it is. All interesting things are controversial.
Well, this is probably more controversial.
But my general question is not specifically about parenting. It is, can we give content to this Aristotelian ideal? You can be a self-defined person if you are allowed, free of state coercion, to make these big choices. The choices about kids, and family, and sex, and death. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? Can you make the big choices to find who you are if the state leaves you alone? Can you make sense of that? That's a strong one for defining Mill's sphere of liberty, immune to state regulation. These self-defining choices. Let me finish the list because I know we're running out of time. How about acts that are super or subarrogatory? Is that a category of action the state absolutely ought to leave alone? Here I think Kant's notion of liberty is very persuasive. When Kant says, in the Rechtsstaat, you cannot coerce virtue, it is self-defeating to use state coercion to make people virtuous. You can indirectly cajole them into virtue, but if you try to coerce them, you lose the very thing you're trying to achieve. If I force you to make a gift, it's not a gift anymore. If I coerce you into making a gift, it's now just another state tax. In which event it's not possible to use the criminal law to make people virtuous. It's got to stay away or we won't have virtue in the world. Which event another criterion of action going on that far side as immune to state regulation by coercion would be acts that are virtuous, i.e. supererogatory. Notice what we're doing. We're building up a list of acts not harmful, not wrong, supererogatory, self-defining, or acts that are not acts at all, but omissions. So far, we've got 5 potential criteria. We're defining that line between what's strongly protected by liberty and what is not. Let me add this last sort of reason in, the third sort of reason, which gives you some more characteristics of actions. Remember when I told you about Yosemite National Park trying to enforce the one-time law against homosexual behavior in the public restrooms? To catch practicing homosexuals, they put one-way glass on the stalls to the public bathrooms, and then they had a ranger sit up there and see what everybody was doing. And if they were doing, you know, normal bathroom sorts of things, that was fine. But if they were having sex in the stalls, that was illegal. I said that's very costly to a state, to have policemen watch your every move to make sure you're not doing something sexually wrong. I went through a series of costs. They're at page 10, pages 194 and 195 of the materials. A set of costs associated with criminalizing some sorts of behaviors. Behaviors that are typically done in private, secret behaviors, where there's no victim who doesn't consent to them. They're victimless crimes. But the behaviors are strongly motivated, like sex, where people will engage in the behavior irrespective of whether it's criminalized. Give rise to a set of costs that most liberal societies find unacceptable. If you try to criminalize certain forms of drug usage in America, for example, the war on drugs turns out to be more costly than it could possibly be worth in terms of prohibition. It's strongly motivated behavior. And all you do by criminalizing it is restrict the suppliers to those willing to be criminals and thus fund organized crime. And you end up with well-funded criminal organizations that own drugs, prostitution, and gambling. Make them all illegal, all you've done is made your society worse by in fact funding organizations that are willing to be criminal because they're prohibiting strongly motivated behavior. So the argument, it costs the state too much. That's different than these arguments. This is just a straight cost argument. It costs the state too much in funding criminal organizations, in the privacy required to detect violations. If you criminalize private, victimless, strongly motivated behaviors. If that's roughly right, we now have 8 different criteria for which you define strongly protected by liberty actions from those that are not. There's nothing wrong with 8 criteria. It's not like you have to pick between them. It might be like Wittgenstein's famous rope. It has 8 different strands, and it vaguely defines a right to liberty, immune to state regulation except for the most compelling reasons. That's at the end of the day where I come out about the strong right to liberty. I don't think you have to choose. I don't think any one of these or all of these in combination gives you the bright line that the U.S. Supreme Court seeks to define fundamental liberties and separate them off from ordinary liberty. But it does give you a workable vague line, the green line on my chart, separating more strongly protected actions from less strongly protected actions, both as a matter of morality, but also as a matter, in our country, of American constitutional law, if people like Randy Burnett and I have my way. Now, what you've just heard is an hour-and-a-half summary of lectures on liberty that will be given in Scotland in about a month and a half, endowed by the United Kingdom's Arts and Humanities Council. And actually, it's been very helpful for me to work them through preliminarily here. So thank you for your participation, even though mostly I know been talking at you as I have. Thank you in general for participating in this seminar. I've really enjoyed it this time. This is my 20th anniversary of giving seminars in Eastern Europe. It's because I think you people have opportunities we don't have for legal systems. You don't quite have the opportunity of the Ukrainians and the Russians, the Poles that we taught in Ratskivy, south of Budapest in 1991. You're not quite the first generation that really gets to decide what kind of legal system you have in general. But yours is still much fresher than ours, and it's a pleasure to talk to people who actually have a capacity that I envy, a capacity to change things that are not so yet embedded. We have a 200-year-old legal system. It's very hard to change anything. It's hard even to pay our bills. Thank you very much.
Местные какие-то легенды, там...
Легенды, документы, фольклор. Он, да, может быть еще полезным, потому что тогда из этих вот маленьких локальных историй может что-то адекватно сложиться. Да? То есть вряд ли они дойдут до как бы самого периода генезиса, то есть там до 9-10 века. Да, но, допустим, как бы на уровне века хотя бы 14-15 они могут быть вполне полезны. Да, и вполне есть, у нас сейчас даже на Севере, я понимаю, что есть, не помню, товарищи, которые занимаются 15-16 веком, на Волыне, например. Да.
Любченко?
Нет, не Блануца. Ну, есть такой, ну, в сборнике постоянно есть, да. Он, правда, экономикой занимается, но, опять же, да, то есть, как бы, имеет, видимо, смысл копать куда-то туда. Я говорю, что, ну, там, например, в любом ли они уверены, что к ним пришли в 16 веке евреи из Богемии, да, ну, понятно, что все это вещи на самом деле не верифицированы, да, то есть тот же Феркович, например, потоптался у нас в Курляндии, заявил, что вот у нас тут есть надгробие 14 века. Кроме него эти надгробия вообще никто не, даже никто не видел. Да. Он говорит, где-то в чистом поле у дороги под Метавой есть надгробие 14 века. Ну, это другое дело, конечно, но в принципе как бы какие-то такие локальные истории, причем которые на самом деле появляются может быть, даже не в еврейских источниках. Да, то есть опять же, могу привести свой локальный пример. У нас замечательная история об отравлении евреями колодцев в 6 курганских городах во время Черной смерти. Встречается в письме города Любека герцогу Брауншвейгскому, по-моему, Люнденбургскому, да, где они там пишут, что эти гадкие евреи, они здесь у нас отравили колодцы, и вот в Курляндии тоже в 6 городах. Там при этом единственное упоминание, по идее, евреям быть не должно. Да. То есть, конечно, вопрос, насколько все эти источники верифицируемые и так далее. Но это как бы достаточно перспективно, с моей точки зрения, какие-то именно совершенно локальные источники. Да, то есть.
Да. А это самое, может быть, еще чего-то какое-то есть, какие-то еще замечания, предложения. По поводу историографии у вас, может быть, есть тоже какие-то еще дополнения, например? Может быть, еще что-то имеет смысл включить, например, здесь в историографию, может быть, что-то не охвачено, какие-то куски.
Ну, сейчас так сложно.
Ну ладно, наверное, тогда хорошо. Это самое. Тогда спасибо вам всем за внимание.
Спасибо.